You've entered BOOKSTORM with Kristen Civiletto and me, Chris Storm. This is a podcast devoted to best-selling books that matter, books that make a difference. We're diving down deep with beloved authors about their stories. We're exposing hot-button topics and heartfelt themes, the issues that affect each of us in our own lives, as siblings, parents, partners, friends, as human beings. We're braving new ideas, fresh thoughts, hard lessons, and important truths. Those kinds of things that stay with us long after we turn the last page and close the book. Well, welcome back to BOOKSTORM Podcast. We have someone here today with us that you're going to be very excited about. You have heard all of the buzz around this fantastic book, Amazing Grace Adams. It was a Read with Jenna GMA book club pick. It was an Amazon editor pick. And we're thrilled because the paperback copy is now out, and we have the amazing author from the UK with us today. Welcome to Fran Littlewood.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's so lovely to be here.
We're super excited to have you. We can't wait to dive into this book. But first, I want to tell our listeners just a few little gems about you because they might be curious. You have an MA in creative writing from Royal Holloway, University of London. Before that, you worked as a journalist, including a stint at the Sunday Times. You live in North London now with your husband and 3 girls. And for anyone who has read the book or wants to, it is a very authentic story. I can see that you are a wife and a mother and a family, and we loved everything about the book. I want to say it's been translated, I see, into several languages. Adriana Trajani, who is a good friend of BOOKSTORM Podcast, we adore her. She's been on our show. She says, Grace Adams is every woman. And this is a stunning debut novel. Leanne Moriarty says, I just adored this beautiful novel. And yes, Adriana and Leanne, Kristen and I could not agree more. It really hit our hearts. And thank you for writing this, Fran.
Oh, thank you so much.
Well, Fran, we like to give the listeners just a summary of what's going on in the story, and I will not give away any spoilers. But first, I want to show them this really cool cover of Amazing Grace Adams, the book we're talking about here.
Yes, it's a very interesting cover, to say the least.
It's a hard-hitting cover. Sit up and take note.
For our YouTube viewers, and if you're not on YouTube, you better check this book out.
Well, in the story, we meet your main character, Grace Adams, and it might be her worst day. She is a mom. She is having a tough time. She's reached the age, first of all, of 45, which according to The Guardian is the very unhappiest age that you can be as a woman, which I thought that was so funny and sad at the same time. But she is having a day where she really is losing it. She's been stuck in traffic. She has had a little bit of a falling out with her daughter. She really wants to find her daughter, connect with her because it is her birthday. And she is bound and determined to bring a very expensive cake to her daughter. And there are a host of obstacles in the way. So we follow her on this very worst day. But this is where we have such an enjoyment because we know these feelings. We know what she's experiencing on some level. And I love this story because one of the things that we know are on Grace's mind is that she used to be awesome. And she might just have to demonstrate that in a big way. So I don't want to give away any spoilers. Did you want to add anything to that background on the story before we get started?
Yes, yeah. I mean, so what will I say? Grace is my fantasy self, really. When she sort of goes out on this long, hot day, she abandons her car in gridlock traffic and she just walks away. As you say, she's had enough. But actually, interestingly, in this moment when it looks as though she's finally losing it, in fact, it's the moment that she rises up and regains control of her life. She's in the process of doing that. So yes, yeah.
Well, that is awesome. Well, Chris, why don't you kick us off? Because we're ready to brave that storm.
I had one word and I just had to say, wow. There is a great irony that I saw in the fact that a person may be able to speak many different foreign languages, but unable to communicate intimately and personally. You showed us through Grace, Ben, and Lottie that spoken words or even lack of words are very important. The reader started to wonder, are hiding words like keeping secrets from each other and maybe even secrets from ourselves when we don't verbalize things? And can we even have a healthy relationship if we can't speak to someone?
It's so interesting. And I love this language aspect of the book. And so both Grace and her ex-husband, when we meet them in the book, Ben, are polyglots. Grace speaks 5 languages. And the first time they meet in the book, Grace is 28 and they meet at a polyglot convention. So it's this sort of huge competition where they're sort of fighting it out with other polyglots to see who is the best linguist. And this is the first time they meet. They're both language nerds, but actually they see something in each other at this meeting. And yes, without wanting to sort of give spoilers, this sort of engenders a rather intense love affair, but then they sort of go off, that life gets in the way and they go off but come back together quite dramatically and suddenly. But yeah, I absolutely loved writing the language into the book. And actually very early on, as you talk about the irony of it, I remember emailing myself a little note saying it's something that ended up right in the last chapter of the book, this kind of that Grace comes to understand the irony of the fact that although she speaks these 5 languages so beautifully, she can't find the words to communicate her heart sickness, her grief at what's happened to her family. So that was a kernel of an idea that I had really early on, and it was so interesting to explore that, because I think it is something that happens to all of us. It happens in all relationships, with our partners and with our families, and actually I think despite our best intentions, with our kids as well, and especially, and as I look at in the book, in the teenage years, where you can feel this sort of gulf in communication opening up, as Grace does with her daughter Lottie. So there was so much to unpack in that. Yeah.
We can all relate to it. It's funny. I think words are free. We can pick any word we want, but they're so powerful. What you say matters so very much, or what you don't say. And we saw that in the book. I think it caused us all to reflect on our own lives and our own family and friendship relationships.
Yeah, it's so true. And actually, I think we fear expressing ourselves sometimes. And as you say, I think this kind of not being honest with ourselves. I think you can get a very fixed position, and it's hard to sort of break out of that sometimes.
Well, Fran, as we were talking about in the beginning, Grace takes us on a wild quest to do one small thing for her daughter. And Grace is bloodied, she is bruised, she is thwarted, but she also has moments of triumph, of reprieve, and maybe even power. And I was wondering if you meant for that journey to be symbolic of parenthood.
Yeah. Do you know, that's so interesting. Because in fact, when I was thinking about that journey, this is a book that, amongst other things, because she's 45, I wanted to tackle this sort of perimenopause, these hormonal changes, really, really head on, but with a lot of kind of dark humor in the mix. So in fact, when I was first thinking about that long, hot day, I was thinking of it as a sort of extended metaphor for the menopause, this sort of day of reflection and reckoning. And finally, she comes sort of triumphantly out the other side. But actually, it's so interesting. I think Stephen King talks about this in On Writing, this kind of, you start writing and then you sort of excavate your themes as you go. They kind of come to you. And I kind of think, I must, at some level, that kind of parenting thing, because absolutely, as you say, it's this sort of her sort of making this kind of very, very difficult day that has moments of real moments of kindness in it as well, kindness of strangers, as well as Grace sort of erupting and ripping up the social contract, and her sort of latent anger coming to the fore. And yeah, absolutely, in there are the kind of highs and lows of parenting and mothering. And I have three daughters, and so I absolutely knew that I wanted to write this into the book. And particularly, they are now 15, 17 and 20, but at the time I wrote it when I was 47, so a few years ago. Two of them were teens and one of them not yet a teen. So I particularly wanted to investigate this kind of time that earlier on in sort of teenhood, that sort of age around the 14, 15, 16, which I think has been less investigated, where your kids start to sort of grow up and away. And it was something that really ambushed me. I hadn't been expecting that sense of loss so early. So I think so there's a scene in the book where early on where Grace walks into her daughter Lottie's bedroom and Lottie slams down her laptop and she's got this sort of look on her face that's sort of, it's vulnerable and it's hostile at the same time, that complete kind of contradiction. And Grace looks around her room at the little objects, the little Buddha, her hoop earrings, to see, you know, looking for clues as to where her daughter has gone and who this sort of stranger in her house is. And I think that's something that I certainly felt, and it happened a lot sooner than had been expecting it to. And there, I think, so it sort of emerges this accidental theme for me, this sort of grief at a mother losing her child to adulthood. In a way, that's something that I really wanted to explore. A cathartic rite.
Absolutely. Well, it was also reassuring because when you look at those high highs and those low lows and the unexpected things, you know, it shows you can never be fully prepared for parenthood on some level. So it should be reassuring because we all feel a little inadequate and ill prepared.
Yeah,
throughout that journey.
It's so true, and I think that never ends, that never goes away.
That's right.
So, you know, and I keep reading. I've been reading Claire Lombardo's amazing new book, and Anne Patchett's as well, and certainly Anne Patchett, I think, and Claire's, they've both got kind of mother figures who articulate exactly that. You know, they're sort of much older, sort of saying, you never stop worrying about your children. I think it's here to stay.
It's here to stay. You know, I always think it's interesting, at least here in the States, we need a license to drive a car. We need a license to get married with classes for both. And anybody can have a baby and bring it home. There you go.
Yeah.
Good luck with that.
Completely. And you think you're going to be different. I remember thinking, I will just love this baby. and it will be different than everyone that's ever gone before me. That will be enough. And it just and also I think this God, sorry.
Isn't it like almost you raising two different people? The first one is a child who depends on you. The next one is a mini adult that needs freedom and just support. And that, I think you brought that out. But I want to dive a little bit more into Grace because I just loved her character so much. I want to do a little introspective into her. Life is hard. We saw it through Grace. We can all relate to it. We have pity. We feel guilt. We have regrets. We have unforgiveness. We have mistakes. We have aging bodies. We have failures. Some of these things are put upon us in life from outside forces. But I couldn't help but think, sometimes we have sort of put these upon ourselves, maybe not purposefully. And I had to ask you, as the author, for Grace and for all of us in the real world, why are we so hard on ourselves? Because we all make mistakes. Why do we focus on all of these regrets and unforgiveness? How do we escape this hole that we dig?
God, it's the $1 million question, isn't it? And I think it's a real woman thing. And actually, I think I will absolutely say, I think part of the problem is that we blame ourselves. It is not our fault. I mean, if you look at the societal narrative, the cultural narrative that tells us that, particularly I think in the midlife space, but for all women and girls, you know, you're meant to be all things to all people. We mop up, you know, the domestic burden, the emotional load. We know we do that much more so than men. And at the same time, we're held to this incredibly high standard. It's a double standard because, again, we're held as women to a much higher standard than men. And much as we might know it and we might be feminists, we might be terribly aware of this, you're bombarded with this societal messaging. And I think it's almost impossible to escape it. You know, I think social media is exacerbating that with this kind of comparison culture, but it very much comes back to him. If I look at compare the way my husband sees things to the way I see things, simply because he hasn't got this pressure on his shoulders, I think from when you're a very, you know, young girl, I think he just doesn't have that feeling of guilt and that burden that I think we have. But I did want to give Grace a sense of agency in the book. This is exactly what I wanted to do, is she sort of goes out on this journey, and as I say, she kind of rips up the social contract. She's had enough, nothing and no one is going to stand in her way, and finally she is kind of finding her voice and using it. And I sort of feel she absolutely is my fantasy self, and this thing feeling like we should all be more Grace, and
Yeah.
and do more of this, so things are better for our daughters when they get there. Yeah.
I loved it when it's not giving a spoiler because it's on the back of the book. She parks her car and leaves it there and gets out. And from that moment on, we're all rooting for her. I was thinking, boy, I'd like to do that sometime.
Yes. And it is this sort of conflict. So at the same time, you feel like she's sort of blowing up her life. Also, she's kind of, I guess, as you say, you're sort of rooting for her.
Yeah, so true.
Fran, I want to ask you, we often talk about how children are resilient and, they'll bounce back from trauma, people say. And I think sometimes as adults, we think that their young age means that they're not always deeply saddened by a
Mm.
trauma or by something that's happened in their lives. But I think this is a really important concept you were exploring, and that is we need to be careful that we're not dismissive of the way that children experience trauma and feel very deeply about these things.
Mm.
What prompted you to explore that? Because that's not something you see often in fiction.
Yeah. I think it's very easy, isn't it, to tell ourselves that we're protecting our children, but they know anyway. And actually, in some respects, it's the worst thing can do. And I mean, coming back to that in a minute, it's being a bit opaque about it, so as not to kind of talk about things that happen in the book. But there is a particular traumatic event in the book, and actually, when I was putting together the idea very early on. The thing that happens in the book is something that happened actually to a family who are at our school and live nearby, and then also a very close friend of mine. A similar thing happened to a friend of hers. And when you're writing in those early stages, I say you have those antennae on, and it just was something that I couldn't stop thinking about. And I often think that when you're sort of writing, sometimes it's easy to veer away from the more difficult topics, and it wouldn't let go of me, so I wanted to write it into the book. And yes, that again, coming back to that theme of language and things not being talked about and not discussed. Is my granny, actually, who, bless her, she died a year or so ago. She was 101, and she
Wow.
always said, and it's very interesting on this, so her mother died when she was 13. She died of TB, and before she died, my granny would say that she would, every time she would walk into a room, she was 13 years old, all the grown-ups would stop talking. And she said more than anything they could have said, what was so frightening for her was the fact that they had stopped talking and they wouldn't say anything. So that kind of sums it up. They know, kids know, and we all do it. We all try and protect them. Yes, something else on a personal note, and I don't often talk about this actually, but it feeds into the similar theme. So when my husband was 44, I was 44 as well. He's completely fine, but he had a stroke, a mini stroke, and then another one again a year later. And one of the biggest things, he was with the kids at the time, it was that trying to sort of almost, never mind, they can hear me upstairs, cover up what had happened. I don't mean cover up, but just to kind of, I remember going into them when he was in hospital and saying, "Oh, Daddy's had a funny turn." It's that, yes, trying your best to kind of keep a lid on it. They know anyway. But yes, that was something that I've thought about. How much did we talk about that? They would come back actually after sort of biology lessons years later, having studied stroke, and obviously feeling some fear. So yes, there was a lot of that kind of swirling around, and so something that again I wanted to look at.
That's very well, it's very profound what you said because, if you don't address some of these things head on, we have children who are not financially literate or literate about their bodies or literate about a myriad of issues, maybe even history. And so it's a form of respect, but it's also something that I think needs to be recognized because they're not just little children to shield from the harsh realities of life, like you say. They are
Yes.
processing this
Yeah.
information.
Yeah,
Right?
and in fact, actually, so throughout the book, a lot of the dialogue, a lot of the children's dialogue, when my kids were small, I made notes of the little sweet, funny, profound often phrases that they said, because I have a terrible memory, so I wanted to kind of keep a note of it. And one of the lines at the towards the end of the book, Lottie comes to Grace and she says, I was thinking about dying. And this is something that one of my children said to me after someone very close in the family died quite young. And it was my middle daughter said, I was thinking about dying, how somewhere in your heart you think about it without knowing. And she said that to me when I think she was 5 or 6 she would have been. And so I've written that into to the end of the novel. So again, just that thing of you think about it in your heart without knowing, they know it's there, it's lodged, even at that really, really young age. Yeah. And I think we skirt it sometimes, don't we?
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing that story. That's very poignant, first of all.
Oh.
Wow. Well, first of all, we have loved having you on the show to talk about this book, Amazing Grace Adams. And
Oh.
before we let you go, we want to ask you two things. First of all, what is on the radar? What are you thinking about next?
Well, do you know, I'm so delighted because only today I've been working on the copy edits, the very final edits of my second book, which will be out next June. So that feels actually quite fast, and it's happening. So this is a book it's about sisters, and it's about sibling rivalry, and it's actually about a father of 3 grown sisters who inadvertently reveals that he has a favorite child.
Oh,
In a moment of
excellent.
crisis. Yeah. So there's quite a lot to unpack there.
Yes.
That's going to be great to dive into. I can't wait for that one.
Well, Fran, we hope you come back on the show to talk about that one. That sounds fantastic.
Oh, I would
And
love to.
yeah, we want to tell our listeners too how to get in contact with you. We know they're going to want to read this fantastic book. They've been hearing about it for sure. And you have a Twitter account, you're on Facebook, on Instagram, and I know that people will want to connect with you. We have just absolutely enjoyed having you on the show. And thank you. I know it's very late where you are right now, so thank you for staying with us until this time.
Thanks
I'm
so
just glad we
much.
didn't have a child bursting in through the door.
Which would have been even more fun, really. We would have loved it. Thank you.
Oh, thank you both. It's been wonderful. Bye.
It has been. Bye-bye.
And Kristen, this is one of the hardest books not to give spoilers because for all of you who are listening out there, you've got to read it to see what happens. It's a wonderful story and we can all relate to it. I love what we got into here about children. It made me think in my elementary school, when we got the school lunch on our plate, there was always a little saying written it, and it said, kids are people too. And I never forgot it because especially with me being older, kids weren't listened to and didn't have the respect that I think that maybe they even do today. Do you agree?
Absolutely. I remember my nanny saying, kids should be seen and not heard. And think of how significant that is of what we're communicating to those kids. And I couldn't agree with you more. I struggled with that because I didn't like that saying, and I didn't like that the older people had that attitude, some of the people in the family. And so I was resolved to do something very different with my kids, and that is engage them and talk to them about what's going on. But I worried I went too far the other way. So if my kids asked me what was going on or expressed a concern, I would always answer them honestly. But that also sometimes opened doors that maybe they're not ready
For
to
more
hear,
questions
right?
that you don't want to answer, like where do babies come from? There's a whole can of worms. But what about this? I thought when she said the transition between childhood to adulthood happens at different times for each child. And maybe
Yeah.
only a mother or father can sense this is the child at 9 who can handle this news. This is the child at 13 who cannot. See where I'm
Yeah,
going? And I think the
absolutely.
fact that you even said you worried about it, I've said this before, but I had a friend tell me once, if you're worried about whether you're a good parent, you're a good parent.
Yeah.
Kind of makes sense, doesn't it?
Well, in this story too, I loved that Grace was also trying to figure out her transition, let alone that of her daughter. And so we kind of see this whole dual issue where they're grappling with change because let's face it, at 45 as a woman, you are undergoing change and you're transitioning into a different relationship with your kids if you have them.
I like that.
So,
That's what I loved about this Grace Adams, that she is allowed to still be her own person, separate from the marriage, separate from the children. She should be her own person.
yeah.
It taught us, I think this is why the book was so popular. We can all relate to it. We saw ourselves a little bit in here. and maybe we learn something new.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I want to tell our listeners about the lineup we have coming because we have some other amazing authors coming on the show. We've got Jeffrey Deaver and Isabella Maldonado with Fatal Intrusion. We have Amy Runyon with Mademoiselle FL. Shelley Noble, The Colony Club, Jessica Strawser, Catch You Later, MP Woodward for the Tom Clancy franchise with Shadow State, Lori Frankel, Family, Robert Dugoni, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, Michael Ledwidge, No Safe Place. We have Linda Cohen-Loigman, The Love Elixir of Augusta Stern. We have Jessica Hagdorn, Dog Eaters, Helena Eklund, Clever Little Thing, Victor Methos, The Silent Watcher. And listeners, we are growing every week. We have listeners in more than 90 countries or territories, all 50 states, 1,900 plus cities. We just love that you're tuning in, and we think you love these in-depth interviews where we dive deep with these authors. So we want you to stay on the radar with us, listeners. You can find us at bookstormpodcast.com. You can find us on Instagram, on X, on YouTube. You can see these amazing videos and authors. Until next time, listeners, you know it. One of the best ways to brave the storm is to dive down deep into life-changing fiction.